Ever been stuck on a runaway train? Okay, well, maybe not literally, but picture this. You're trying to switch tracks to a train moving at a different speed. That smooth transition, that's kind of what your clutch is doing every time you shift gears.
That's a great analogy. It's the unsung hero of smooth driving in a manual transmission, allowing you to seamlessly transition between gears without grinding those gears, something you definitely don't want to experience.
You're telling me. I still remember the sound of my first car grinding gears after I rode the clutch a little too long. But before we get into what happens when things go wrong, let's break down how this whole clutch system works when it's running smoothly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
At its core, your clutch is like a mechanical handshake between the engine and the transmission.
Okay.
This handshake uses friction to connect and disconnect the flow of power to the wheels, allowing you to change gears without bringing everything to a screeching halt.
Okay, so it's managing the power flow from the engine to the wheels. But how does it actually do that? What are the key players in this mechanical handshake?
Well, let's start with the workhorse of the system, the clutch disc. It's this disc covered in a special friction material, kind of like high-performance brake pads, that sits between the engine's flywheel and the pressure plate. When you press the clutch pedal, you're disengaging the disc, allowing you to change gears. When you release the pedal, the disc is pressed against the flywheel, transferring power to the transmission and ultimately your wheels.
So the clutch disc is taking the engine's power and transferring it to the transmission through this friction-based system. What about that pressure plate you mentioned?
The pressure plate is what clamps the clutch disc against the flywheel, creating that all-important friction. Think of it like a strong grip that keeps everything connected. It's responsible for making sure the power transfer is smooth and efficient.
Starting to get a picture of how this all fits together, kind of like a perfectly synchronized mechanical dance.
Exactly. And like any good dance partner, we need a way to smoothly disengage and re-engage. That's where the release bearing comes in. When you push the clutch pedal, you're activating the release bearing, which pushes on the pressure plate, releasing the clutch disc and interrupting the flow of power.
Ah, okay, so the release bearing is what allows us to actually shift gears without everything exploding. What about that spinning thing instructors are always warning about when you're learning to drive stick?
You mean the flywheel. It's bolted to the end of the crankshaft and plays a crucial role in smoothing out the engine's power delivery. It's like a kinetic energy storage unit that helps smooth out the combustion process and keep your ride from feeling jerky.
Right. It's all about a smooth ride. And I know we've got seals and O-rings in the mix too, right?
Exactly. Don't underestimate those little guys. They may be small, but they're essential for preventing leaks and ensuring the hydraulic system, which we'll get into later, functions properly. Imagine trying to bake a cake without properly greasing the pan. It's all about those little details.
Little things, big impact. So this whole intricate system is what allows for that smooth driving experience. But what happens when this mechanical handshake starts to falter?
That's where things can get a little bumpy, and you'll start to notice some telltale signs that your clutch might be wearing out.
Okay, so our clutch is starting to show signs of wear and tear. What should we be on the lookout for? What are the red flags that scream, time for a new clutch?
One of the first things you might notice is clutch slipping. Imagine this. You're trying to accelerate, you hit the gas, the engine revs up, but the car doesn't respond the way it should. It's almost like your car is stuck in mud, even though you're on dry pavement.
Ugh, yeah, I've definitely felt that before. It's like trying to run in quicksand. You're putting in the effort, but you're not getting anywhere fast.
Exactly. That's a classic sign that your clutch disc is worn down and isn't gripping the flywheel properly. Another thing to watch for is difficulty shifting gears. If you feel grinding, crunching, or resistance when you try to shift, especially when starting from a standstill, that's another sign that your clutch is crying out for help.
And I'm guessing ignoring those signs can lead to bigger problems down the road.
Absolutely. It puts unnecessary stress on your transmission, and we all know transmissions are not cheap to fix. Think of it like this. Would you rather address a loose thread on your favorite shirt now, or wait until the whole seam unravels?
Definitely better to catch it early. Are there any other warning signs we should be aware of?
Definitely pay attention to any strange noises coming from the clutch pedal itself. If you hear squeaking, squealing, or a rattling sound when you press the pedal, it could be a sign of a worn-out release bearing or other problems in the clutch mechanism.
It's like your car has its own language, and those weird sounds are its way of saying, hey, pay attention down here.
Precisely. And just like you wouldn't ignore a weird noise coming from your own body, you shouldn't ignore those sounds coming from your car.
So let's say we've noticed one or more of these red flags. What happens next? Is it time to roll up our sleeves and tackle a clutch replacement?
Well, while understanding the process is incredibly empowering, actually replacing a clutch is a fairly involved repair. Um, it's not something you want to jump into without the right knowledge, tools, and a healthy dose of caution.
That makes sense. So for those brave souls who are mechanically inclined and maybe have some experience under the hood, let's walk through the clutch replacement process step by step.
Sounds good. But before we even think about grabbing a wrench, let's talk about preparation.
All right, so what's the first rule of Clutch Replacement Club?
Safety first, always. You want to make sure you're working on a level surface, the vehicle is securely supported with jack stands, never rely solely on a jack, and the battery is disconnected. We don't want any unexpected surprises while we're under there.
Safety first, can't stress that enough. Okay, so we've got our safety gear. The car is prepped and secure. Battery's disconnected. What's next?
Now we need to access the clutch itself. Now this part can vary depending on your vehicle's make and model. Some cars are definitely more mechanic-friendly than others.
Right, like trying to change a light bulb in a shoebox versus a cathedral.
Exactly. Generally speaking, accessing the clutch involves removing the transmission, which means disconnecting things like the shift linkage, drive shafts, and anything else that might be in our way.
Okay, so we're talking about some serious disassembly here. This is definitely where having the right tools and a good service manual for your specific vehicle is crucial, right?
Absolutely. This is not the time to be winging it. Each car has its own quirks and nuances, and the service manual is like your treasure map, guiding you through the process. Once you have access to the clutch, you'll disconnect the hydraulic lines. Those are the lines that carry the fluid that helps you engage and disengage the clutch smoothly, kind of like the brake lines in your car.
Got it. Hydraulics are key for that smooth operation. So the hydraulic lines are disconnected. What's next?
Next, we carefully remove the pressure plate and clutch disc. Remember those key players we talked about earlier? We want to remove them as a unit, being careful not to damage the flywheel, which is bolted to the engine.
It's like we're performing surgery on a car.
That's a great way to put it. And just like in surgery, precision is key. Now that we have the old clutch out, we can move on to the detective work, inspecting the components for wear and tear.
Okay, so the old clutch is out and we're on to the detective work. What are we looking for when we inspect these components?
This is where having a keen eye for detail really pays off. We're looking for any signs of wear and tear on all the parts, but especially on the flywheel.
And remind me, the flywheel is that part bolted to the engine that helps smooth out the power delivery, right?
That's right. Now, because the flywheel surface is constantly interacting with the clutch disc, it can experience some wear and tear over time. We'll be looking for things like hot spots, which are areas of discoloration caused by excessive heat and friction, or grooves and scoring, which are basically indentations worn into the flywheel surface.
And those would definitely affect how smoothly a new clutch would operate, right?
Exactly. It'd be like trying to ice skate on a bumpy pond. Now, depending on the severity of the damage, you might be able to get away with having the flywheel resurfaced, which is basically like giving it a nice, even sanding.
Ah, so kind of like hitting the reset button on the flywheel?
Precisely. But if the damage is too extensive, you'll need to replace the flywheel entirely. And trust me, it's better to spend a little extra on a new flywheel now than to have to tear everything apart again down the road.
That's some sage advice. What else are we checking while we're down there in the clutch compartment?
We also want to take a good look at the release bearing and the pilot bearing. Remember we talked about the release bearing playing a key role in disengaging the clutch. Well, like any part with moving components, it's subject to wear and tear. We're listening for any squeaking or rattling, and we're checking to make sure it moves smoothly and without any resistance.
So no grinding or catching when we're checking that release bearing.
Exactly. And as for the pilot bearing, that little guy helps align the input shaft of the transmission with the engine's crankshaft. Again, we want to make sure it spins freely and isn't making any unusual noises.
Got it. Smooth operation is the name of the game here. So let's say we've inspected everything and we're ready to install our new clutch kit. What happens next?
This is where things get really satisfying. We're basically going to retrace our steps, but in reverse order. We'll start by carefully installing the new clutch disc, aligning it perfectly with the flywheel and pressure plate.
And I'm imagining this alignment process requires a bit more precision than just eyeballing it, right?
You got it. We're going to use a special tool called a clutch alignment tool. This tool helps ensure the clutch disc is centered perfectly within the pressure plate and flywheel assembly.
Right, because if the alignment is off, it can cause all sorts of problems down the road, right?
Exactly. We want to make sure everything is perfectly aligned for smooth engagement and to prevent premature wear on the new clutch components.
Makes sense. Precision is key here. So the clutch disc is aligned. What's next?
We'll install the new pressure plate, making sure we tighten the bolts to the manufacturer's specifications using a torque wrench. Again, this is where that service manual really comes in handy.
Right, those torque specifications are like the recipe instructions for tightening bolts. Too loose and they could come undone too tight and you could damage something.
That's a great analogy. And once we have the pressure plate torqued to spec, we can reconnect the hydraulic lines, making sure all the connections are tight and secure.
It's all coming together.
It is. Then we'll carefully reinstall the transmission, remembering to tighten all the bolts and reconnect all the necessary sensors and wiring harnesses.
Wow, that's a lot of steps.
It is, but with patience and attention to detail, it's definitely doable for the mechanically inclined. And once everything is back together, we can reconnect the battery, refill any fluids we may have drained during the process, and double-check that everything is buttoned up tight.
Okay, so we've prepped, we've replaced, we've double-checked our work. What's the moment of truth?
The test drive, of course. This is where we get to experience the difference a new clutch makes. But before we hit the open road, we need to make sure everything is working as it should.
Right. We're not just going to jump in and hope for the best. So what's the test drive protocol?
First, with the car still safely on jack stands, we'll start the engine and slowly depress the clutch pedal. We're listening for any unusual noises and feeling for any resistance as we run through the gears. Everything should feel smooth and precise, like a hot knife through butter.
Right, like that satisfying click when you know you've shifted gears perfectly.
Exactly. If everything sounds and feels good, we can lower the car and take it for a spin around the block slowly at first. We're listening for any unusual noises, feeling for any vibrations or slippage, and making sure the clutch engages smoothly.
And if everything checks out, we can finally enjoy that smooth, responsive driving experience that a new clutch provides.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much of a difference a new clutch can make. It's like your car is thanking you for giving it some TLC.
Speaking of TLC, any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap up our deep dive into the world of clutches?
A couple of things. First, we can't stress this enough, consult your vehicle's specific service manual. Every car is a little different, and using the right procedures and torque specifications is crucial.
Couldn't agree more.
And second, when replacing a clutch, always replace the whole kit, the disc, the pressure plate, the release bearing. It might be tempting to just replace the worn part, but trust me, it's worth it to do the job right the first time.
So after diving deep into this intricate world of clutches, how has your perspective on that little pedal to the left changed?
It's not just a pedal. It's a vital link in the chain of power and precision that allows for the joy of driving a manual transmission.
Well said. Until next time, keep those gears turning and that curiosity engaged.